I want to welcome my guest. It's Dr. Herbert London, a former candidate for governor of New York. He heads up the London Center for Policy Research. It's also known as a think tank. They do research on key policy issues, including national security and energy. And I want to welcome Dr. London onto InfoWars. How are you today?
Joel, pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.
Can you tell our audience what exactly does a think tank do? What does the London Center do? And how do you influence policy in Congress and even the White House?
Well, one of the things that we attempted to do is, of course, introduce policies that would make sense for the United States. We don't have any particular partisan agenda. Our goal is to see whether, in fact, there are policy issues that would be appropriate for the United States, considering the fact that during the Obama years, we did not really have a foreign policy. So, again, the way in which we do that, we talk to people on the Hill, we organize seminars, we try very hard to insinuate our ideas into the Trump administration, which we have done somewhat successfully. And so it's always a question of trying to use whatever leverage you have in order to influence the course of history.
Okay, so let's start with, what do you think led to the meeting with North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Trump, and what do you think will come of this meeting?
Well, as far as the catalyst for it, it's very hard to say, but my own feeling is what you have is a regime that is desperate, absolutely desperate. You keep in mind that the GDP of North Korea is about $1 billion. The GDP of South Korea is more than $1 trillion. There's no comparison between the two. And it's also true that what you have in Kim Jong-un is someone who's a third-rate, fourth-rate dictator. The very fact that the president of the United States would meet with him lends prestige to North Korea. They've won the first battle. But it seems to me that Trump is engaged in a high-wire act, and he may turn out to be a very, very successful wizard turning that wheel behind the curtain. There's no doubt in my mind that what we have here is an interesting set of events. You have North Korea that has nuclear weapons, but they have nothing else in the country. It is dark, it is dank, it is dim-witted. But you have, again, a South Korea that could provide an awful lot. The very fact that Kim Jong-un can no longer provide for his own soldiers, can no longer provide for what is necessary, even for the very, very modest introduction of economic reform into the country, clearly suggests that he is amenable to some sort of negotiation. Now, if I'm Trump, one of the things that I would say to him first thing is, make sure you get 2 guarantees before you get on Air Force One: denuclearization and unlimited verification. You get those 2 things, then I think it's appropriate for the president to start engaging in negotiation. After that, we can talk about aid, we can talk about, I don't know, even as many pork bellies as necessary to feed the population. But nothing should occur until those 2 guarantees are put in place.
Okay, Herb, how do you feel about Trump's tariffs? How will the tariffs on steel play out, and does Trump have a valid point on national security?
Look, one of the things you have to understand about tariffs, by and large, tariffs are a tax. And I don't like taxes by and large. I mean, overall, it's not very good for the consumer. And if you're talking about an unfavorable balance of trade, it's a question of what happens to that unfavorable balance on your side. Do you spend the money adequately? Do you need it for other industries? Does it create jobs? It's very, very difficult to say. So tariffs, as a generalization, has to be seen within a certain kind of context. The other point that I would make about this is that when you're talking about this, the president has already engaged in backsliding. He is saying, now we will negotiate with the Chinese on the $60 billion. So it wasn't as if he said, you know what, this is blanket reform, we're going to introduce this. He is going to start a negotiation with the Chinese about the $60 billion, just as he has already said to the Europeans and to both Mexico and Canada, we will keep you, again, outside the realm of this tariff regimen. So I do think that even though he's imposed these tariffs, we're already seeing that the president is moving away from them.
Okay, look, Donald Trump is criticized nonstop about his lack of expertise during the campaign and on all the cable channels, of course, that aren't Fox for the most part. How do you assess his foreign policy successes so far? And is he really lacking in expertise, or is he all instincts and maybe good instincts in the end of the day?
Look, I think that this president is not an intellectual. He would probably admit as much. But his instincts happen to be very good. And what we have found on the foreign policy front is that the president, I think, has probably done quite well. If I'm giving him a report card, I would say probably a B. And I'm a tough grader. But I think it's important to understand that what he's inherited is a very difficult set of situations across the globe. And the president has to react to them. Most of the nations that were once allied with the United States lost confidence in America during the Obama years. And he has to restore that confidence. That's not an easy task. Whether you're talking about Sisi in Egypt, or the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, or even Abe in Japan, the president has to reach out to our allies and convince them that the United States is a dependable ally. Not an easy task, but something that I think he has done quite well.
Well, you wrote a book called Leading from Behind, the Obama Doctrine and the U.S. Retreat. How bad and how much damage did Barack Obama do to the last 50, 60 years of foreign policy consensus that asserted and projected American power around the world?
Well, Joel, I think you understand this matter very well indeed. But what you had with Obama was this naive belief that the arc of history was moving in our direction. And as a consequence, it was not necessary for the United States to engage in any form of intervention, whether it was military intervention or even peaceful intervention, that the United States was going to opt out of foreign policy. And so we saw a continual and, I must say, incremental withdrawal from international affairs. That is one of the reasons why Trump has this difficulty. If you create a vacuum in international affairs by the departure of the United States, that vacuum will be filled, very often filled by bad actors. Those actors could be ISIS, they could be they could be China, they could be the Iranians, but there's no question that that vacuum will be filled. We have to understand vacuums in international affairs can be very dangerous. Therefore, American participation is necessary. And that doesn't mean that we have to play the role of policeman in the world. I do not believe that for a moment. But it does mean that the United States' diplomatic activity is critical in dealing with international affairs.
Okay, we got about another minute. How do you feel about the personnel changes and the direction that Trump is heading? We just changed out McMaster for John Bolton at the National Security Council. Does that make you more comfortable and more optimistic that he's heading in a direction that will secure America's allies and defenses around the world?
Look, I know John. I think he's terrific. I think it was a great move on the part of the president. As far as I'm concerned, it's one of the key moves that have been made by this presidency. I think that John Bolton has the imagination as well as a kind of understanding and experience in international affairs that make him an ideal candidate for national security advisor. I'll tell you a story very, very briefly. Years ago, when I was the president of the Hudson Institute, I would often have lunch.
You got about 10 seconds. Let's get the story at the top of the next segment after the commercial. We'll be right back with Alex Jones Show and InfoWars. Welcome back to InfoWars. Joel Gilbert coming to you right from the left coast. We want to finish up with Dr. Herbert London of the London Center for Policy Research. Herb, we wanted you to share a story about one of your experiences when I asked you about the NSC.
Look, this is a story about John Bolton, and it involves a colleague of mine at the Hudson Institute, Robert Bork, who you may remember was converted into a verb. Robert has passed this mortal coil, but was a great friend, an extraordinary jurist, perhaps the finest jurist in America, former Solicitor General, and at the same time, someone who taught at Yale Law School for several decades. During that period, when he was at Yale Law School, he taught every power elite individual in Washington, D.C., whether it was Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, John Kerry. I mean, you go down the list. There's probably no one of note who didn't study constitutional law with Robert Bork. During the course of lunch, I said to Robert, tell me about your students. And he said, I've taught everyone of any power or influence in Washington. And I said to him, who was the best student you ever had? He looked at me and he said, that's easy. I said, that's easy? Based on all the experience that you've had? He said, yes. By far the most intelligent, the most imaginative student I ever had at Yale Law School was John Bolton. Now that's high praise. Well,
that's high praise. That's a fabulous story since he's coming on only in a few days. Dr. London, thanks for being here, and appreciate all your insight to all the audience here at InfoWars. Thank you.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.